Hello, in this video I want to continue with a recent series looking at the claims of ancient lost high technology, advanced machinery, etc. and follow on with some experiments actually using granite and testing those claims. So experiments in ancient technology, removing striations in black granite. These are actual circular saw marks. I got this piece of granite from a very kindly donated by the stone supplier once he heard what I was doing. He's from family generations going back of stonemasons going back to the Mid-East, and well, yeah, so they kindly helped me out and gave me different samples with different tool marks, different surfaces on them. So these are actual modern circular saw marks, and it's important to know because whether you've worked with wood or you've probably seen circular saw marks, and anyway. So this is one of the often used stones, talking about lost high tech. So it's impossible to do this without, we see that it's not a straight line, it's a curve there, and there we see the close-up striation. So it's impossible to do without a high-speed circular saw. They keep saying that Chris Dunn, for instance, is often quoted in all these other clones, say that these types of marks, these groove striations, can only be achieved with a high-speed tool. Well, that's clearly not true, and they say it's impossible with copper hand tools. These just recently posted this using a copper handsaw. It's actually a straight edge to begin with, but because of the particular type of action I was using, it wears down into what would appear to be a giant circular saw blade, but it's not, and it actually leaves those striations. I'll link that in the description, as well as an earlier one on the claims of ancient circular saws and just the pseudoscience nonsense that surrounds those claims. So here we see those striations where we see that curve in it. This is a black granite, modern circular saw blades. You'll notice that the way that these cut, it's clearly different as well. So according to the major distributors of lost ancient high technology, advanced ancient power tools and ancient aliens, they might differ in details, but they all come back to the same thing. They say it's either impossible to do with primitive tools, or it would take an unimaginable amount of time. Well, we don't need to imagine, we can do it with experimentation. So this is a type of image that they would promote. So whether it's advanced power machines, because you can't do it without it apparently, whether it's the it's the words speak, pictures speak for itself, or whether it's this type of image, they all come back to this, that they had to have machinery at least as advanced as ours, whether it was a Earth-based civilization or whether it was an interstellar civilization. But they all say because it is impossible without advanced ancient machinery, whether it's intergalactic laser stone cutters or whether it's a more earth-based, but still that is the basis of their claims. It is impossible without advanced ancient machinery. It is impossible with primitive tools, or that it would take an unimaginable amount of time. Well, we don't have to imagine. So using only advanced techniques, how long does it take to remove these marks? So if it was a machine, it would be done in a short time. So, like, why are they not removed? But how long would it actually take using just primitive technology to bring these types of marks down to a smooth, honed surface? Now, that's a important reference, but I'll describe honed, polished, and etc. But I'll link this video in the description, the Serapeum at Saqqara. I go through the boxes one by one using close-up photos. That it's clearly not flat as Chris Dunn and all the followers, Brian Foster, Uncharted XDT, TV, Mystery History, Lost History Channel, all these people keep saying these just erroneous statements. They're not, and I go through the boxes one by one. I'll try to remember to link that in the description as well, because it's clearly not machined. But the important part is, especially, I think it's box 17, which is one of the famous ones where they say it's perfectly square. Well, again, we can see, and that it's flat. Again, the imagery shows it's not. So if that was flat, there wouldn't be a gap there between the straight edge, and they're not square either. But the important part is on the roof, we can still see on the lid, the bottom half of the lid, and it's important because the insides are much more detailed than the outsides, but even the interior of the boxes are not precise and not machined. They just not those lost high ancient technology advanced machinery claims are just not true. But so the question is, how long would it take to have completed this process and leave a honed surface? The boxes are described as polished. I'll get into that, the difference between honed, polished, etc. in a moment. But in that same box again we see, they're not flat. For instance, if the length of that square was different, it would not be 90 degrees. Even the 90 degrees sort of doesn't, if you look closely at these pictures, I'll link the IZITA project where they've got hundreds of pictures going through each box individually, close-ups as well, where you can see now, for instance, in that portion there, if we close up, the reflection shows that the surface is not even, it's not flat, it's not even honed. So we'll do experiments in that. So how long would it take to finish and remove these striations? And in the next video I'll also go into how long would it take to finish these surfaces and create a truly flat, honed, proper surface. So these are two pieces of black granite. This is honed, as it's called, and this is polished. Now it's basically the same thing. Now honed is flat, but the grinding action has a coarser grain. Polished, you get a really fine grain, and then you keep grinding it down. So a honed surface will have microscopic scratches, lots and lots of them, so it doesn't have that reflective surface. Like different definition, but polished is that it's been ground down to a really, really smooth surface, causing that reflection. But you can also create a polished look by applying, just like a car polish or silver polish, there's applications to make honed granite look polished as well. So for instance, this is a natural stone. Now that's a split face, and I'll explain that a little bit more in a moment, but this side has been treated with an enhancer or a sealer. Notice the stains as well. So this is also can be seen in the Serapeum, where there is this fluid has gone over the edge, and this is described by the Kermit School, Bert and Ernie, that this is evidence that they were basically melted with some sort of chemical process. But that's the stain. Now that's an enhancer or a sealer. It makes natural surface look like it's wet to give it that sort of polished look. But that's a split face surface. I'll explain that. That's not a honed surface, that's split face. So that's honed when it's dry, but now if you apply water to it, makes it look as if it's polished. It's just wet. Now an enhancer gives it a permanent wet look. So if we compare honed dry and honed wet, looks like polish. Now there's sealers, polishing agents that can turn natural stone into this permanent wet look. So using only ancient techniques, how long does it take to remove these marks, bringing the granite to a smooth or a honed surface? So this is a block that I worked with. This was my second experiment. I'll include the first at the end of the video because that was successful, but I wasted a lot of time. But this is before and this is after, where we have a honed surface. And it's this after is, I'll show now. The picture doesn't show it because these are all the little crystals and make it look like it's not flat, but that is flat. When you hold a straight edge against and shine a light underneath, no light shines through. It's not precision flat actually, but by that light test it is. But there's another way to test it which shows that it's not flat, but I will achieve precision flatness, perfect flatness on a piece of granite in future episodes. Very simple technique. Primitive, just before the machines and advanced tools, and they were originally made by hand and they needed to be precise. Now how did they achieve their precision before precision machinery? It had to be done by hand, and there are ways to test to make that, and I'll go into more in that, like perfect precision flatness in future videos. But the Serapeum boxes, etc., definitely not flat. They're not even honed to a close to flat surface. So using only primitive techniques, it took me 1 hour and 4 minutes, including stoppages, to apply abrasive and water, etc., to achieve this. Now the block itself is 19.5 centimeters by 40 centimeters, or 780 square centimeters, or 0.84 feet squared. However, I made mistakes. This was my second experiment. I still made some noobish mistakes. For instance, this was the sandstone block that I used. If I used a larger block such as this, I would have covered more surface area and would have finished even sooner. And even that block I could hold in even this large block I could operate with one hand very easily. So if I'd used an even larger stone, I could have achieved a larger surface area in the same or less amount of time, but I'll explain these in the end. Now the technique I used again was just abrasive. Now, and these advanced machinery proponents, lost high ancient tech, in their videos they always poo-poo the idea of abrasive sands. Now the weird thing is they promote advanced machinery which relies on abrasives, yet they poo-poo the idea of ancient abrasives. It's this logical inconsistency. I don't know how to explain it, but anyway, the abrasive mix I used was crushed white quartz, limestone, granite, and corundum. I used very coarse grains in this particular experiment. In later I used finer grains. I mixed it up a little bit. Sandstone will be applied during the test, because as the sandstone grinds down, it adds crushed sandstone, ground sandstone to the mix. So sandstone's included, but that gets added by the I used a sandstone block in this example. In other experiments I use granite on granite, but with of course an abrasive in between.
One larger one.
Let's begin.
So we can work out the area and get into it now. These fibres are because I don't have a corundum line, so I had to source the from the aluminium oxide, or the corundum from. I was using cloth abrasive paper and just burning off the back, and but now I was breaking up masonry, so there's grinding discs are aluminium oxide, so whether it's stone or metal, they use that as the abrasive still now because it's much cheaper than diamond and pretty available. Alright, let's just start grinding. Let's see how quickly we can. Now I'm starting with some larger grains, and now I've learnt from experience to how to improve it. So that's the sound we want, the grinding sound, but these larger bits will break down. In my first attempt I crushed it down to a finer, but the grinding itself will break these down and will actually help with the process. Regularly adding the abrasive, my first attempt, I wasted quite a bit of time by not adding regular abrasive, but it's important just to, let's quickly just talk about different granite types of surfaces and finishes as well, because what's described as polished, for instance the Serapeum boxes, the sarcophagus in the Great Pyramid, doesn't technically qualify as a polished surface in many ways. So this is a split piece of granite. It won't be easy to see, so what you can do is, like with this chalk test, you can see this has not been, this is not flat. There's also there's high and low points. It's basically like splitting a piece of granite, such as in feather and wedge technique. Definitely not polished, not even honed. However, by applying water, it gives it that reflective surface. It gives it the appearance of being polished, and this I think is an important point in regards to, for instance, the Serapeum boxes and a lot of these granite work in Egypt. Now, If I turn off the light for a moment, I can further demonstrate. So I'm just going to get a straight edge and use a light and do one of these tests for, is it flat? So I put my straight edge against it, and you can see, a bit of focus, that the light penetrates underneath the surface. It's definitely not flat, not even is the camera catching that? Get it in focus in that section. So you see the light coming through. This is far from flat. Both sides of this black granite block were originally like that. Now, black granite also has a greyish tinge to it. You'll see that in the Serapeum boxes, that there are parts that haven't been surfaced or polished, still have this grey colour. So I've honed this. I'll show this experiment later. It actually takes a very short time to go from a split face to a honed surface. And I'll turn off the light again. And if we do the flatness test, there are a few pits in there where the light will shine through, but it is, I haven't actually even, there's another stage to go to get it to precision flatness, but that'll be the next stage using the free plate technique. But for the moment, this is qualify as a honed surface. And again, if you just put some water on it, and now it has the appearance of being polished. So honed, now a sealer or a colour enhancer would give that stone the same effect. Now here's another example. So this is polished from the factory. Now polishing technically is still to grind it down, but with really fine particles to get it really smooth and to remove scratches. Now this is honed, but if you look at it at a microscope, there are tiny scratches which stop it being reflective. Now you can get over that with water. That's modern factory polishing. And the backside was also this was originally heavily striated, but I'll show this example as well. And I turned this into a honed surface, and the same thing. Just give it that wet look, and it can be as polished. Now, of course, the water will dry off in a short time, but there are treatments that are permanent or very long lasting to give it that polished look. And so the difference between split face, polished, honed, and proper polishing as opposed to enhancers or sealers, which give it that, turn the natural look into the polished look. So this will be important because it's in regards to, again, the Serapeum boxes, the sarcophagus in the pyramids, the Great Pyramid, etc. They're often described as being flat and highly polished. That's just not true. At least not in the way that word should be used.
That particular colour of a slurry is the same as the sandstone block because the sandstone is actually being ground down as I'm grinding the granite. Although sandstone is a very easy stone to work with on Mohs hardness scale, it is almost equivalent to granite. So that's one of the big mistakes you'll hear in regards to various stones and lost high ancient precision machinery technology. Sandstone actually makes a great abrasive, even though it grinds down quite quickly. So after 49 minutes we clean up the stone, and almost all traces of those original actual modern circular saw marks have disappeared. So they're very faint, you can see them there, but if you compare them to the original, it's only 49 minutes later. The people who promote lost ancient high technology and advanced machining are the same people who just keep repeating it's impossible, it's impossible. They point at a stone and say it's impossible. They'll also claim that experimental archaeology does not exist and just will keep showing one particular clip from one particular documentary. Instead of listening to them, if you listen to the people who have done the work and the videos and the published papers, and then experiment for yourself. Experience is the best teacher, as well as paying attention to teachers. You tend to learn. And so one of the things I learned was that as I was grinding, now I'm doing it horizontally on the tabletop, but as I was grinding, the stone would become like a suction cup effect, would become very hard to move, or it would become locked in place, and I had to get a piece of timber to knock it off. The bond was that strong. So in my first experiments, that taught me to regularly add water, and also not too much water, depending. It's a tricky thing. But what I found was that so people who were grinding, polishing the sides, for instance, of a sarcophagi or of a Serapeum boxes, even with a heavy stone, their workload would have been reduced if they're doing it clever. The stone actually sticks to the side, and if you get your mix right, you almost don't have to support the weight of the stone at all. So there we can see in the bottom right corner the original condition and the finished stone, and to get an idea of the honed or nearly honed surface, but very, very flat, is just by placing your hand, and even the way that the moisture joins it. Now, flaws would show up. However, there are flaws in there. They're not visible to the eye, even like close-up inspection using the camera, which does not. It appears that all the striations have gone. To the naked eye, there are a few other techniques to reveal that very, very faint striations still in there, and I'll show you in a moment how to reveal flaws that even a straight edge and light does not show up quite clearly. So as a reminder, we have the before and the after, where actual modern circular saw marks, and we completed the stone. 19.5 by 40 centimeters, so 780 square centimeters, or 0.84 feet squared, including stoppages such as stopping to change to add some water to keep the abrasive going. A team would have an assistant, which would reduce the time again, but 1 hour and 4 minutes to remove any visible trace of the striations.
Okay, there we have the stone again. Now, this is honed. Well, it's actually not. It would appear to be sweetly honed, but it's actually not quite there yet. But those striations are no longer visible to the eye, even with the camera close up. Again, if I apply some water to it, it gives it now this enhanced or this sealed look, which is, would appear to be polished, as it's called. But polishing, yeah, it's a different process where it's very fine grains applied, but now we have the appearance of a, so we can take a natural, or actually not a natural, a honed surface, and apply a, water does it temporarily, but there's a permanent treatment. So previously they would use egg yolks, olive oil, resins, lacquers, and in the past. And that's what, for instance, the Serapeum boxes must be have some sort of sealer enhancer applied to them. But now I'll take the light away. All right, let's try this again and avoid out of focus Christopher Dunn type of methods. And so let's show. I know that this is not perfectly flat yet. Very, very close to it. And now, for instance, if instead of some grainy photos and testimony, okay, now that's in focus. Now that's a straight edge and light. It passes the test, but I know it is not. There are some places where there should be some pitting coming through. Okay, let's. Okay, I don't know if the camera's going to show it. There's like a pit, a tiny little hole, and I can see some light penetrating through there. There's a bit there. Well, I know it's not flat, but it will pass the flatness test in that sense, but I know it's not, and I'm going to get it closer to before. So this is an okay test, but there's a lot of yeah, it's not as good as what some would proclaim, because as we'll see in a moment, I can, by using a piece of chalk, I can show that it is not flat yet. So yeah, so it's definitely not flat yet, but there is, it's getting there. These striations are actually still in here. They're tiny. They're not visible to the eye. They're not visible when it's dry. They're not clear when it's wet. And that light and straight edge technique, it's a good indicator, but it's not anywhere near as good as what is promoted.
I'll link the full tour of the Serapeum where we go through all the boxes one by one and show up that they're clearly not machined, and because they're clearly not precise, neither flat, but even the description of polish. Now here's just a selection of a photo. So firstly, they're not honed, that they haven't been brought flat. You can, like, once the light shines on them, which is often used as evidence of this precision machining, actually reveals quite the opposite. So when you see the close-up, so there's pits, there's shallow and high points. Now, to be polished by the general description, you would have to have, fine-grained sand or powder, and really get in and like rub the surface and polish it. Polished. However, well, you could say that only part of it was polished. But depending on how the light shines, again, you can see first it's not honed, it's not precise. Even by hand tooling standards, like as we saw with these experiments, you can do much better. In a small team, in a couple of days, could have finished these off to a high precision. And again, we see, firstly, they're not precise, but the issue is polishing, and whether they were like truly polished or whether they've had a sealer applied, a color enhancer or a polishing gel. And again, you just see all these, so not just the damage that might have been done later, but the actual surface where we see this pitting. But the important parts are, okay, for instance, this one is really telling, because if it was truly, if they were all, now, for instance, if it was truly polished, you'd need to get, to rub up against it, including all these inside. The outside, the high parts could be polished, but then the dark spots, the pits, the holes, have not been, because, well, how do you'd have to get in there with a toothpick and rub it. But when we look at, especially this one, I think is very telling, because it indicates, so if the pits, if the deep parts, you can't polish in, like, they're chaotic, and so you have, like, you're in there with a tiny little brush grinding and grinding. So that's I would believe that's more of an indication of a sealer, or of, like, still now granite you can get just like a car polish, the wax. So they've had something applied to it, and this is a normal, even in antiquity, in Romans up through the Renaissance, their granite and stone, they would apply sealers, polishers to there. So that's an interesting question in regards to the nature of what's described as polished. Is it like physically polished, or has it had a polished agent to it? And clearly, because all of the boxes have this deep pitting, then, like, for instance, they're not flat. You can see when the straight edge is held up against it, they're not right angles, they're not flat, they're not precision. So this is about the difference between honed, polished, and sealer, or a color enhancer, and I believe that would be an indication of color enhancing. So again, we see two pieces of granite. One has been honed and the other has been polished. So this is split stone, so that hasn't even been honed this side, but then once we apply an enhancer or a sealer to there. It gives it that wet look that it seems to be polished. Now, because that stone is actually very rough, it hasn't been honed or polished. So there's honed dry and there's honed wet. That's that's the stone on work that we see here in this experiment. And a comparison of honed dry and honed wet looks very similar to polishing. So box 25, for instance, external surface is processed but not polished. Inside surfaces are polished. But that's the inside there, and so we see there the comparison where it appears to be one side is like natural face, it's honed but still on its natural, and then it's only been half applied. Now whether that was done originally or whether it's done later, I'm not sure, but it would still like lend itself towards well, this is another example. So the underside of the lid doesn't have that's 17, I believe. Again, not straight, not precision. Very amazing work, but let's be truthful about what they are. We don't have to invent things to make them amazing when the truth it is they're good enough on their own. But what's often pointed out by this precision ancient machining lost high technology promoters, what we have here is that there's this residue underneath. Now that's very simple. So if you apply this sealer, it runs over, so it have to be analyzed to be sure, but I think that's what's going on there, because you see the difference between the top and the bottom of a stone, where that lid there, the top and the sides have this polished look and the underside doesn't. Well, because where the residue is, it does have that dark tone, but it's light grey underneath. This brings us back to the original question. How long would it have taken to complete the process and leave a honed surface, especially on these all so important, massive amounts of energy, massive amounts of work, all so important, whatever the purpose is, they clearly went to some effort to build these. So how long would it take? That's 17. Let me check that. Yes, sorry, that is 17. So we have the external dimensions of the sarcophagus, 3.8 by 2.17 by 2.3 high. So the bottom of the lid, where these striations are still showing, where they haven't been removed, has a surface area of 8.246 meters squared. My second experiment, inexperienced, noobish, still a lot to learn. I completed this. I removed the visible striations. Even when it's wet, they're not visible. I was able, at very, very slowly as well, I was able to do 780 centimeters squared in 1.1 hour and 4 minutes with no assistant to help me add the water and the abrasive. I was using this small hand size. That was one of my mistakes. I should have chosen a larger stone. I should have even actually chosen a larger stone than this one. But even this stone is more than, that's basically fits into the palm of your hand. So even working from underneath, this is more than manageable. So a team of 4 who could have easily fit into that, we see there the size of the box. Team of 4 easily could have fit in there. 3 shifts of 9 hours using the small stone, they could have completed this box and brought it to a honed surface to make it, to remove all these traces. Basically half that time again, if they hadn't made the mistake I had used and just used a larger stone. I could have even used a larger stone, but half that time again. So, and less still if I had an assistant to help them with the water and the abrasive. Easily 12 hours with an inexperienced team of 4 and 1 assistant could have knocked this lid, the bottom of this lid off in 12 hours. So basically one long working day. I'm sure they didn't have the 8-hour day and all the work safety rules that we have now. I think it's very important to note that I am still a total noob at all of this. At the end of this second experiment, which I'm showing now, I'll show a synopsis of the first one at the end, I am still, I didn't even have 6 hours experience. I hadn't completed my first day in my apprenticeship. However, in that short time, I had learnt quite a lot, but I'm still experimenting with what's the best stone, what's the best abrasive, what's the best technique, and all these small important points. So imagine a team which had 1 or 2 years, or let alone a couple of generations of experience to draw upon, and how they could reduce the time and be much more efficient than I am. If they had advanced precision power tools and you know, all this, well, it would have been a matter of minutes to finish just this particular part. And as this is just one example. So the Lost High Technology people show these examples all around the world using Stone Age techniques, primitive techniques, in a very short amount of time, considering any sort of king or chieftain would have been able to harness hundreds or thousands of workers. Why was it not finished? So there must have been a lot of blackouts and breakdowns with this advanced precision ancient technology at the time. Or using Stone Age techniques, and they just, the Great Pyramid, the other pyramids in the sarcophagi, more of the rule rather than the exception to have these incomplete, not properly finished, not properly honed, certainly not flat and certainly not square, as we saw in the tour of the Serapeum. But again, Great Pyramid would be the obvious example, but so many others. If they had this advanced precision in the Serapeum boxes, for instance, which are said to be evidence of advanced precision power tools, then why are they so imprecise? Why are they so unfinished? Why are they not honed? Why do they have pits and they're not flat and they're not square? So, well, good old Stone Age technology. First, it can do it, and it's really, yeah, so they don't have a leg to stand on in regards to this. And when they say impossible or unimaginable amounts of time, I'm not sure what they, you know, maybe they're so used to getting 30-minute pizzas delivered, they've forgotten that things take time and energy goes into it. You can't just dial up, you know, Uber Eats or whatever, you know, things take time. So they need to, you know, get some experience, you know, some real-world experience underneath their belt, and understand that these things, firstly, they take time, but even with Stone Age techniques, we're knocking these things over in days or weeks. And so even if it took a month or 2 months or 3 months to build these individual Serapeum boxes with a small team, so what? Given that they're so important, you know, they went to such energy, how is a few months or even a year, and again, in 1 year, just with primitive technology, you could knock out one of these boxes and actually build it to higher, more honed, more precise. Just with simple tools like plumb lines and the builder's square, you could, and stone hammers and abrasives, you could achieve these things in that amount of time. But if it was done, if they had advanced precision machinery, it should have been, firstly, they should have been knocked over in a couple of days at the most, and therefore they should be able to mass produce them. There should be not just 25 here and a few here and some in the Serapeum at Alexandria. There should be tens of thousands of them, especially given the timelines that they like to extend the history back tens, you know, add 5, 10, 20,000 years to it. So it just doesn't work. They don't understand, you know, even they don't understand Stone Age technology, and they certainly don't understand advanced modern technology, because these things will just be churned out, you know, off a production line and precisely, uniformly with standards made. But this is just not, the evidence is entirely the opposite of what they claim.
It's time to stop! It's time to stop, okay? No more!
In the description, I'll link a series of other videos where people are achieving what is said to be impossible with primitive tools and techniques. If it was impossible, the argument of therefore it must be lost advanced precision power tools, etc., etc., would be a valid argument. However, it is not impossible as they claim. Therefore, they have no evidence. The whole argument surrounding this advanced ancient precision power tools is that it's impossible, therefore. However, this is the kind of thing that is being deleted and censored from the comment sections of the people who claim to be truth seekers and the people who claim that there is a suppression going on. Exactly, the suppression is done by them to suppress the truth, the reality. My first experiment along these lines was inspired by this unfinished sarcophagus. The method which has been cutting, I'll link some videos there, but what we see, exactly the same saw marks we see as from a copper tool, but it was these striations, and this is on, I believe that's rose granite, but this was what inspired me, so I thought, well, put your money where your mouth is, and so I went to the stone supplier, and they were happy to oblige once they knew what I was doing. Piece of black granite with those striations. That was my first experiment, and it's 1 by 1.5 feet, or so 1.5 square feet. It took me, on my first attempt at this, in all 4.5 hours of grinding. Actually, just a bit short of that, let's just call it 4.5 hours. I made several mistakes. So firstly, I did not add enough abrasive regularly, and I used stones with a small surface area. That was a sandstone piece, so I was thinking that the sandstone and the quartz in there would help. You even see by the color, the mud has this orange. That's the color of the sandstone mixing with the mud. Then I changed my mix, and I added, rather than a tiny portion of corundum, I added a large amount, larger. Still, I use this emery mix, which is mixed with crushed quartz, limestone, etc. And I added the mix more regularly. So the first 3 hours was pretty much wasted. Very little grinding was I was grinding down my sandstone, but I wasn't really grinding the granite, and I used a larger plate. So that first experiment, 1.5 square feet of black granite to remove those striations, took 4.5 hours, but again, the first 3 hours were pretty much largely a waste because I wasn't adding the fresh abrasive enough, and I used a small surface area, so that led me to this second experiment. But even at that noob first day, my first day at work doing this grinding, making all the noob mistakes, I could do 1.5 square feet of black granite in 4 hours, but again, because I was working on my own, so the time wasted doing the water and so forth, but also the by not adding abrasive regularly enough, like only every 15 minutes, whatever, I wasted a lot of time. If you add the abrasive regularly, in that final 1.5 hours, the amount of grinding that I brought this heavily striated piece of black granite down to smooth granite, which is at a higher smoothness than most of the Serapeum boxes, and I'll show you that as well. Apart from using a larger stone, I also improved my rate of production by stopping to add fresh abrasive more regularly. And it's not just the sound, it's also the feel, but this is the sound you want to hear. Here we see one of the unfinished sarcophagi from Egypt, and those striation marks which perfectly match the cuts using copper and abrasive, Stone Age technology. Here's the original side of the black granite with the striations, and I'm using black granite, not red granite, and this was the result after 4.5 hours. Again, the first 2.5 to 3 hours could have hugely improved that, but the level of the smoothness, the flatness here, will check back on that because it compares and surpasses that actually of the Serapeum boxes. Something else that I learned by doing this was that the mud slurry especially at certain consistencies, but pretty much happens throughout the process, is it creates a suction cup effect. So that I'm doing it flat, but if you hold it on the vertical, the stone itself sticks. So even a very heavy stone would become much lighter and easy to move. So you could be polishing the top of the box of the lid and doing the sides as well, and polishing the sides would be much less strenuous in terms of energy than what I had assumed.
My third experiment along these lines was starting with split face granite, which would be the same type of face you would get from the quarrying technique of plug and feather, where large blocks can be extracted in minutes. And so we can turn split face into a highly honed flat surface in roughly about 1.5 square feet in just over 2 hours. And again, that was just my third experiment, and that'll be the point of the next video, because this would relate to many other sites. For instance, the granite walls in the Great Pyramid, the Osiron, the Khafre Valley Temple, and many of these other sites which include granite. Most of Egyptian construction is limestone or sandstone with only small portions of granite, but that'll be for the next video. With experience of the first two experiments, turning split face into honed is actually very quick, only using Stone Age techniques, which happen to be exactly the same as modern techniques, only they've added high-speed motors and equipment to help. But Stone Age tech, it works, and the amount of time to achieve these things is only a tiny fraction of what the lost ancient high technology advanced precision machinery argument would claim, but they also would say that these things are impossible as well, so they're wrong on everything.